Picture this. Somewhere in ancient Australia, roughly 30,000 years ago, a person is trying to solve a problem that has been annoying hunters for as long as hunting has existed. They need to throw something at birds or small prey at a distance with enough force to stun or kill the target, without requiring so much physical effort that the act of throwing is exhausting, and ideally without losing the throwing implement every single time, because wandering across open landscape to retrieve a stick after every unsuccessful throw is a productivity problem that compounds badly over a long hunting day. The obvious solution, a throwing stick, already exists. Hunters have been throwing curved sticks and clubs for a very long time across multiple continents. The straight stick is an older technology still. But throwing sticks have a frustrating property. They go where you throw them, and when they miss, they are now over there rather than here. And here is where you are. And over there is where you have to walk to get them back. And the bird you were trying to hit is gone. What if the stick came back? Not in any intentional designed sense. Nobody sat down with engineering drawings and said, "I shall now invent the returning boomerang." What happened was almost certainly messier, more accidental, and more interesting than deliberate invention. It was the kind of discovery that the entire history of human technology is full of. Someone noticed something unexpected, found it useful, and did it again on purpose. The history of how ancient humans invented the boomerang is the history of one of the most extraordinary pieces of applied aerodynamics ever accidentally stumbled upon by a species that, at the time, had no word for aerodynamics and probably no concept remotely equivalent to it. And it is a story that reveals, in compressed form, almost everything interesting about how human technological innovation actually works. Start with the non-returning boomerang, because almost everyone gets this part wrong and the confusion matters for understanding the invention story. The boomerang that most people picture, the returning kind, the one that flies in a curved arc and comes back to the thrower when it misses, is not the original boomerang and is not, in most traditional contexts, the primary hunting tool. The returning boomerang is a specialized variant of a much older and more widespread technology, the throwing club, or hunting stick, or non-returning boomerang, which is a curved or angled piece of wood designed to fly straight, travel long distances with stability, and hit prey with substantial force. Non-returning boomerangs, sometimes called kylies in Australian Aboriginal traditions, have been found archaeologically across an astonishing geographic range that is almost never mentioned in popular discussions of boomerang history. Ancient Egypt, boomerang-shaped throwing sticks have been found in tombs, and King Tutankhamun's tomb contained multiple decorated examples. Ancient Europe, a curved mammoth tusk throwing stick found in Poland dates to approximately 30,000 years ago, and has the aerodynamic properties of a hunting boomerang. Native American cultures had throwing sticks. Ancient Indian cultures had throwing sticks. The curved, angled throwing implement is one of the most widespread hunting tools in human history, appearing independently on multiple continents in forms that share the basic aerodynamic geometry. What makes Australian Aboriginal boomerang culture distinctive, and what makes the returning boomerang an Australian development, as far as the current evidence indicates, is not the basic throwing stick itself, which appears elsewhere. It is the discovery and deliberate development of the aerodynamic properties that make a boomerang return. And that discovery, even if it happened elsewhere at other times, was most thoroughly developed and intentionally applied within Australian Aboriginal traditions over a period spanning tens of thousands of years. To understand how the returning boomerang was invented, and why it works, requires understanding enough aerodynamics to see why a curved piece of wood that spins through the air behaves so counterintuitively. A returning boomerang is, in its essential physical nature, two wings joined at an angle, spinning like a propeller as it flies through the air. When a wing moves through air, it generates lift, the aerodynamic force perpendicular to the direction of motion and the wing's surface. In an airplane, this lift acts upward, opposing gravity. In a spinning boomerang thrown horizontally, the wings are oriented to generate lift that acts sideways, horizontally, rather than vertically. The spinning creates an asymmetry. As the boomerang spins, one wing is moving in the direction of the throw, while the other is moving backward relative to the throw direction. The wing moving forward is moving faster through the air than the wing moving backward, because its rotational velocity adds to the translational velocity of the throw. Faster movement through air generates more lift, so one side of the boomerang is generating more lift than the other constantly. If that asymmetric lift simply pushed the boomerang sideways, it would curve and fall. But spinning objects respond to asymmetric forces through a phenomenon called gyroscopic precession. Rather than turning in the direction the force is pushing, they turn 90 degrees away from that direction. A spinning top pushed to the left doesn't fall to the left. It rotates around its axis in a way that moves the top in a different direction. The same physics applies to the spinning boomerang. The asymmetric lift force, combined with gyroscopic precession, causes the boomerang to turn in a continuous arc, rather than flying straight. If the aerodynamic geometry is right, the correct wing cross-section shape, the correct angle between the two wing sections, the correct mass distribution, the correct spin rate relative to forward velocity, this continuous arc brings the boomerang in a full circle back to the thrower. This is not magic. It is not even particularly exotic physics. It is the same gyroscopic precession that keeps a bicycle upright, that makes a spinning top stable, that causes rifled bullets to curve slightly in crosswinds. It is a fundamental consequence of how angular momentum interacts with external forces. But describing it this way makes it sound like someone could have worked it out from first principles, which is completely false. No one in the Paleolithic had angular momentum equations. The invention of the returning boomerang was not a feat of applied physics. It was an empirical discovery. Someone observed that a piece of wood thrown in a way came back, found this remarkable and useful, and began deliberately trying to reproduce the effect. The question of exactly how that empirical discovery happened is where the history becomes speculative but deeply interesting, because the archaeology and the physics together constrain the possibilities in illuminating ways. The most plausible origin pathway starts with the non-returning hunting boomerang, which was already in use across Australia for hunting birds and small game. These implements were carved from naturally curved wood, particularly from the curved junctions between tree roots and trunks, or from branches with natural bends, and shaped through working with stone tools into the familiar angled form. The process of carving and shaping these implements from natural wood produced objects that varied considerably in their geometry, weight distribution, and cross-sectional profile. In a population making many throwing sticks over many generations, some would occasionally be carved in ways that approximated the aerodynamic geometry of a returning boomerang. The cross-section shape, a curved upper surface, and flatter lower surface, like a wing, that generates the differential lift needed for the return path could emerge from carving without any intention to produce it, simply as a consequence of how wood naturally splits and how stone tools remove material. A throwing stick with accidentally correct wing geometry, thrown at the correct spin rate and angle, would curve noticeably in flight. Most of the time, it would curve without completing a full return arc. It would go sideways and crash somewhere unexpected. But occasionally, under the right conditions, it would curve into something approaching a return trajectory. And when it did, the person who threw it would notice. Noticing unexpected behavior in a tool and choosing to investigate it rather than dismiss it is not a universal human response, but it is a response that hunters, people whose survival depends on understanding the behavior of objects in motion, are particularly well positioned to make. A hunter who noticed that a throwing stick curved back toward them when thrown in a certain way would have had immediate practical interest in understanding and reproducing that behavior. The returning trajectory meant the stick came back to them. That was useful. That was the kind of useful that paid attention to. The deliberate refinement from accidental observation to reproducible technology is the phase of the invention story that most fascinates and that reveals the depth of observational and experimental intelligence available to ancient humans. Reproducing the returning behavior required understanding. Even without explicit aerodynamic theory, What variables mattered? Throw angle relative to the horizon matters. A returning boomerang needs to be thrown nearly vertically, not horizontally like a flat stone. Spin rate matters. Insufficient spin produces a wobbling flight that doesn't generate the necessary gyroscopic stability. The cross-sectional profile matters. A flat stick doesn't return. A wing-profiled stick does. The angle between the two wing sections matters. Too acute or too obtuse, and the return arc doesn't close. The mass distribution matters. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Ancient Australian Aboriginal craftspeople developed the returning boomerang to a degree of refinement that modern aerodynamicists examining traditional examples with sophisticated measurement tools describe as impressive even by current standards. The wing cross-sections in traditional returning boomerangs are not crude approximations of airfoil geometry. They are precise, consistent, and aerodynamically effective implementations of exactly the cross-sectional profile that generates appropriate lift for the return trajectory. The angle between wings, the taper toward the tips, the subtle twist in some examples, all of these features are present in traditional boomerangs at levels of refinement that imply centuries or millennia of iterative improvement through empirical testing. This refinement process happened without any written theory, without any measuring instruments beyond human hands and eyes, without any conceptual vocabulary for the forces involved. It happened through the accumulated experience of makers and users noticing what worked and what didn't, passing that knowledge through oral tradition and practical demonstration, and progressively selecting the features that produced better returning behavior over the features that didn't. This is empirical engineering. It is the same process that produced sailing rigs, bow designs, and clay pottery before any formal theory of fluid dynamics, material science, or structural mechanics existed. The knowledge was practical, procedural, and embodied, stored in hands and eyes, and the accumulated cultural transmission of how to make the thing correctly, rather than explicit and theoretical. But it produced results that modern theory can fully account for, and that modern engineers examining the products describe with respect. The wood selection practices associated with traditional boomerang making illuminate the depth of material knowledge involved in the technology. Different wood species have different density, stiffness, grain structure, and natural curvature that affect boomerang performance in specific ways. Australian Aboriginal craftspeople developed sophisticated knowledge of which species produced the best boomerangs for different purposes. Hunting sticks that would fly far and straight, returning boomerangs that would curve back reliably, heavier war clubs with different balance properties. Mulga, a dense, fine-grained acacia wood, is one of the most frequently mentioned traditional boomerang woods, prized for its hardness and resistance to splitting. The natural curvature available in mulga roots and branches made it valuable for boomerang production without requiring excessive carving to achieve the angled form. Other species with appropriate properties were selected across different regions, reflecting local botanical knowledge applied to a technological requirement. The harvesting and seasoning of wood for boomerang making was itself a skilled process. Green wood is easier to carve, but changes shape as it dries, requiring either immediate finishing to the final shape or knowledge of how the wood will move during drying to cut the initial form slightly differently in anticipation. Controlling the drying process, shaping wood while wet, then allowing controlled drying in orientations, allowed craftspeople to introduce or remove twist in the boomerang in ways that fine-tuned its flight characteristics. Heat treatment was another variable in boomerang production. Heating wood in coals or over fire alters its material properties in specific ways. It can straighten natural curves, introduce new curves, harden the surface, and improve the stability of the finished shape. Traditional craftspeople who used heat treatment in boomerang making were applying what modern materials scientists would call thermomechanical processing, the intentional manipulation of material properties through controlled heating to tune the performance of their aerodynamic implements. The archaeological evidence for boomerang antiquity provides important context for understanding the invention timeline and the geographic scope of the technology. The oldest confirmed boomerang in the Australian archaeological record dates to approximately 10,000 years ago. A complete wooden boomerang found in South Australia in an arid cave environment where the dry conditions preserved organic material that would have decomposed elsewhere. This date is almost certainly not close to the actual origin of the technology for two reasons. Organic material preservation in archaeological contexts is extremely rare, meaning the absence of older examples reflects preservation bias rather than actual origin timing. And there is strong reason from the technological sophistication of early examples to believe the technology had been developing for a much longer period. The Polish mammoth tusk throwing stick mentioned earlier, dating to approximately 30,000 years ago, is not a returning boomerang in aerodynamic form, but it demonstrates that the basic curved throwing implement from which the returning boomerang developed was present in the human toolkit at least that far back. If the returning boomerang was independently developed in Australia, it was developed from a throwing stick tradition that was already ancient when the development occurred. Cave paintings and rock art depicting boomerang use extend the Australian visual record back further than the physical artifact evidence, and engravings that appear to represent boomerangs have been identified at Australian sites dating to over 20,000 years ago. The interpretation of rock art is always uncertain. The images require interpretive assumptions about what they depict. But the consistency of certain curved implement forms in ancient Australian rock art with known boomerang forms is suggestive of considerable antiquity for the technology. The returning boomerang's practical applications in traditional Australian Aboriginal culture were more varied than the popular hunting weapon framing suggests, and understanding the full range of uses illuminates why the technology warranted the investment in refinement it received. Bird hunting is the most frequently cited use, and it was a primary one. Flocks of birds, particularly waterfowl, could be targeted with returning boomerangs in ways that maximized the probability of a hit. The boomerang thrown over the flock, curving back across the birds as they flew in startled response to the approaching object, could contact birds that initially appeared to be out of range. The unpredictable curved flight path was disorienting to prey in a way that a straight flying projectile wasn't. But returning boomerangs were also used as decoys in waterfowl hunting, thrown to imitate the flight of a hawk, causing ducks or other waterfowl to dive toward the water in the evasive response to aerial predators, straight into nets stretched above the water surface. This use transformed the boomerang from a simple projectile into a hunting decoy, an application that required understanding not just the flight physics of the boomerang, but the behavioral responses of the target species to aerial threats. Musical and ceremonial uses of boomerangs are documented across multiple Australian Aboriginal cultures. The clapping sticks used in ceremonial contexts are related implements, and boomerangs themselves were used rhythmically as percussion instruments in some traditions. The acoustic properties of different wood densities and shapes produce different tonal qualities when struck together, and traditional knowledge of which combinations produced which sounds was part of the cultural knowledge associated with the implements. Boomerangs also served as digging implements, as fire-making tools when used as friction fire hearthboards or fire starting sticks, as cutting tools in emergency contexts, and as exchange items traded across extensive social networks. The same piece of shaped wood served multiple purposes in a material culture where carrying specialized tools across large distances of the Australian landscape imposed real costs, and the boomerang's combination of functions made each implement disproportionately valuable. The geographic specificity of the returning boomerang to Australia, and the question of why such an apparently useful technology didn't appear in other cultures with curved throwing sticks, is one of the more interesting puzzles in the comparative history of technology. The straightforward answer is that it almost certainly did appear in rudimentary form in other cultures with curved throwing sticks, but wasn't recognized as useful or wasn't developed beyond the initial observation. The returning behavior of a thrown stick with accidental wing geometry is interesting, but not necessarily obviously useful to a hunter using throwing sticks, primarily in contexts where the target is on the ground. The return trajectory of a boomerang is curved and unpredictable enough that it requires practice to exploit, and it only becomes useful if the hunter takes the time to develop that practice. Australian open grassland and semi-arid environments created hunting contexts where the returning boomerang's utility was maximized, particularly for bird hunting over open water, where nets could be deployed in combination. The ecological context may have provided stronger motivation to invest in developing the returning boomerang from an initial observation into a refined technology. The absence of returning boomerangs from other cultures may also reflect the contingency of technological development more broadly. The fact that many technologies are possible in principle from available materials and knowledge, but are only actually developed in cultural and ecological contexts where the combination of accidental observation, recognition of utility, and sustained cultural investment in refinement all happen to occur together. The returning boomerang may have been available to many cultures with curved throwing sticks, but only in Australian Aboriginal cultures did all the conditions for its development happen to align over a long enough period to produce the refined, intentional technology that has been documented. The legacy of the returning boomerang in understanding human technological intelligence is perhaps the most important dimension of its history, and it's the dimension that tends to get lost in the "isn't this a cool artifact" framing. The returning boomerang represents a category of human technological achievement. The empirical discovery, through iterative refinement over extended time, of a physical principle sufficiently complex that it resisted formal theoretical understanding until modern aerodynamics developed the mathematical tools to describe it. The principle, gyroscopic precession combined with differential lift generation from asymmetric wing velocity, was discovered through hands-on experimentation and cultural transmission of practical knowledge, producing a functional implementation that predated formal theoretical understanding by tens of thousands of years. This is not unusual in the history of technology. Sailing ships exploited fluid dynamics that weren't formally described until the 19th and 20th centuries. Arch bridges exploited structural mechanics that weren't theoretically formalized until much later than their construction. Fermented foods exploited microbiology that wasn't understood until Pasteur. Human technological intelligence regularly outpaces theoretical understanding because empirical experimentation and practical refinement are more powerful routes to functional technology than theory-first approaches for most of human history. The person who first noticed that a throwing stick came back when thrown in a specific way, and who chose to pay attention to that observation and investigate it further, was doing something cognitively sophisticated. They were treating an unexpected observation as information rather than noise. They were asking what variable produced the unexpected outcome. They were experimenting, even without the word or the formal concept, by varying conditions to understand what mattered. That capacity, noticing, questioning, experimenting, refining, is the capacity that produced every piece of human technology in the archaeological record, from the first deliberately shaped stone to the electronics in whatever device you're reading this on. The boomerang is one of its oldest and most elegant expressions. It started as an accident. It became a refinement. It became a technology so sophisticated that modern engineers, examining it with full theoretical understanding of the physics, describe it as impressive. And it came from a person, 30,000 or more years ago, who threw a piece of curved wood and watched, with the specific attentiveness of a curious human mind, as it curved through the air and came back to them. And then threw it again, on purpose to see if it would do the same thing. It did. And here we are,